The night was thick with stillness, the kind that wraps around you, amplifying even the smallest of sounds. Emily lay in bed, her eyes drifting open as her husband Ben shifted beside her. At first, she thought he was just mumbling in his sleep, but then she heard it clearly, unmistakably. Judy. Her heart jolted in her chest. She blinked in the darkness, her pulse quickening. Who the hell was Judy? Emily's name was not Judy, never had been. She told herself it was just a fluke, sleep talking. Everyone muttered nonsense in their sleep from time to time. But as she lay there, staring into the dim ceiling, the unease gnawed at her. The next morning, she brushed it off, though the tension lingered in the air like an invisible weight. She didn't mention it to Ben over breakfast. What would she even say? The conversation felt strange in her head before she could even speak the words aloud. But as they sat sipping their coffee, something felt different, subtle but unmistakable. Ben was quieter than usual, distracted. Then later that day, as they sat on the couch watching TV, it happened again. Judy, can you pass me the remote? Emily froze. The words hit her like ice water down her spine. She turned slowly to Ben, her stomach twisting in knots. What did you just say? Ben barely glanced away from the screen. I asked if you could pass me the remote. You called me Judy. Ben chuckled softly, shaking his head. No, I didn't. What are you talking about, Em? There it was. Em, her name. Emily. But something about his casual denial made her skin crawl. The moment passed, but the tension did not. Over the next few days, things grew worse. The name, Judy, that slipped out more and more often, sometimes in passing, sometimes in conversation, sometimes as he looked her straight in the eye as if she were someone else. Each time Emily corrected him, her voice tight with unease, but he'd laugh it off or brush it aside as if nothing were wrong. You're hearing things, he'd say, that odd smile playing on his lips. Or worse, he'd look at her with such certainty, such unwavering conviction and say, You've always been Judy, what's wrong with you? Her friends didn't understand. When she reached out to them, the conversations felt hollow, as if they couldn't grasp the creeping terror that had begun to shadow her every thought. He's probably just joking, one friend suggested. Guys can be weird with pet names. But this wasn't some harmless joke. Emily felt it in her bones, a sense of unraveling, like her identity was slipping through her fingers. She began noticing other small things. Sometimes when she called out to Ben, he wouldn't respond right away, as if he didn't hear her, and when he did, his eyes seemed distant, as though he were looking at a stranger, not his wife. One evening, she asked, Ben, do you remember where we met? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, Judy, we met at the park near the lake. The words didn't make sense. She and Ben had met in the city at a cafe, nowhere near any lake. Emily's blood ran cold. Her voice shook as she whispered, Ben, that wasn't me. The smile faded from his face. He stared at her, blinking slowly as though processing her words, but his expression remained blank. What are you talking about? He said finally. That was with you, Judy. Emily's heart raced in her chest. This wasn't a slip of the tongue anymore. It was something far worse. A deep, gnawing fear settled into her bones. What was happening to him? The world around her felt as if it were shifting subtly in ways she couldn't fully grasp yet. Her reflection in the mirror seemed off, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. Was it her mind playing tricks? Was Ben confused? Or was there something darker lurking beneath his calm demeanor? Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the cool surface of the nightstand, her mind heavy with unease. Ben had left for work hours ago, but his presence lingered in the house like a shadow. The name Judy echoed through her thoughts, an unwelcome guest in her home, in her marriage. And now other things had started happening, things she couldn't ignore. The first strange behavior came subtly, almost innocently enough to pass as an oversight. Ben forgot their anniversary. It wasn't just forgetting the date. He acted like the event never happened. When Emily brought it up, trying to laugh it off and make light of it, Ben's face remained blank, his eyes distant. What are you talking about, Judy? He asked, tilting his head as if she were telling him some obscure, far-fetched story. Ben, our anniversary. We went to that restaurant on the riverfront, remember, last year? He looked at her like she had said something absurd, like she was making it up entirely. I don't remember that, he muttered, brushing past her to the kitchen. We never went there. Emily's throat tightened. We did, she thought. I know we did. She could still taste the food, feel the warmth of his hand in hers that night. But when she followed him into the kitchen, she saw him moving about as if nothing was wrong, humming softly to himself. He acted as though that memory, that entire part of their relationship, had been wiped clean. As the days passed, more cracks began to show. One morning, she caught him staring at her from across the room, his eyes unfocused. He was holding something, a small, delicate bottle in his hands. It was an old-fashioned perfume bottle, glass with a thin gold cap. She had never seen it before. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Ben smiled faintly, that odd, empty smile she was growing to fear. "It's yours, Judy's." Her skin prickled. "That's not mine, Ben. I've never seen it before." He didn't respond. Instead, he placed the bottle on the bathroom counter and walked away, leaving Emily standing there, her mind racing. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The scent was foreign to her, a heavy floral fragrance that clung to the air, thick and oppressive. She put it back down, feeling a deep unease as if touching it had linked her to something old, something wrong. The nights were worse. Ben had always been a restless sleeper, but now it felt different. He would toss and turn, muttering under his breath, always that name, Judy. Sometimes he would sit up abruptly, staring at her with wide, unfocused eyes before lying back down as if nothing had happened. Emily tried waking him once, gently shaking his shoulder, but when he turned to her, his expression was eerily blank. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. "You were calling me Judy again," Emily whispered, her pulse quickening. "That's not my name, Ben." He stared at her for a long moment before saying, almost robotically, "It's always been Judy." She lay back away, her body tense, unable to sleep. The darkness of the bedroom felt suffocating, closing in around her. The sounds of the house at night, creaks, soft thumps, became amplified, each one making her flinch. She began to wonder if it was just Ben, or if there was something else, something unseen. Emily started to notice small but disturbing changes in her surroundings. She would wake up to find things slightly moved, her makeup brushes out of place, her jewelry box open when she swore she had closed it. At first, she thought she was simply being forgetful, but the pattern became too clear to ignore. One night after Ben had fallen asleep, Emily went to the bathroom to wash her face. The mirror was fogged from the shower earlier, and when she wiped it clear, she noticed something odd, a small handprint on the glass, much smaller than Ben's or hers. She stared at it for a long time, her reflection wavering behind it. Was she imagining things? Her stomach twisted with fear, but when she looked again, the print was still there, unmistakable. And then there was the scent. That heavy floral fragrance from the perfume bottle seemed to follow her throughout the house, even though she never used it. It would creep into rooms where she hadn't been, hanging in the air like a presence. Emily would wake up in the middle of the night to that smell, her throat tight with panic, feeling as though someone had been standing right next to her. The worst part, though, was Ben. His behavior grew more detached, more distant. There were times when he wouldn't respond to her at all, as if he couldn't hear her. He began coming home later and later, never explaining where he had been. His eyes, once so full of warmth, now seemed cold, empty, as if he were looking through her. One evening, Emily asked him directly, "Where do you go every night?" Ben paused, his hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. He didn't turn around, didn't answer for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down her spine, he whispered, "You wouldn't understand, Judy." Emily felt a cold terror rise within her. She stepped back, her mind racing. Who was he talking to? Was she really losing him? Or was she losing herself? Was she still Emily? Or was Ben seeing someone else entirely? That night, she lay awake for hours, her mind spiraling. She could hear Ben muttering in his sleep again. That damn name, Judy, over and over. She turned away from him, pulling the covers tight around her, trying to block out the sound. But sleep wouldn't come. Suddenly, she felt a weight at the end of the bed, like someone sitting down. Her heart pounded in her chest, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. Only the faint smell of the perfume hung in the air, cloying and nauseating. Something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just Ben's behavior that was changing. There was something else in the house. Something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Emily woke up drenched in sweat, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her like cobwebs. In the dream, Ben had been standing at the foot of their bed, staring down at her with that same hollow expression he'd worn for weeks now. Only in the dream, she wasn't herself, she was someone else. Judy. The name echoed in her mind as she sat up, struggling to shake the feeling that she was becoming a stranger to herself. She swung her legs out of bed and glanced at the clock. 3:23 a.m. Ben was fast asleep beside her, his breath slow and steady, but somehow she felt entirely alone. The days had turned into a blur, and time no longer felt linear. She was losing track of hours, sometimes entire afternoons, her memory slipping in and out like a broken reel of film. She'd find herself standing in rooms with no recollection of how she got there. Worse, she began noticing strange things about herself, things that didn't add up. One morning, she found herself wearing an old floral dress she hadn't seen in years. The fabric felt stiff, unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. She stared at herself in the mirror, fingers trembling as they traced the fabric. Had she put it on? When? Why couldn't she remember? The memory lapses became more frequent, more terrifying. One afternoon, Emily woke up sitting at the dining room table, a cold cup of coffee in front of her. The last thing she remembered was stepping into the kitchen to make lunch. Hours had vanished. She tried to piece it together, but her mind was a fog. She reached for her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but when she looked at the call history, her blood ran cold. The last outgoing call was to someone named Judy. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen, her mind reeling. She had never called anyone by that name, had never known anyone by that name. How could it be there? She pressed Ben about it that evening when he got home, her voice brittle with fear. Why does my phone say I called Judy? He looked at her with an unnerving calm. Because you did, Judy. The way he said it, it wasn't playful, wasn't confused. It was flat, certain. Emily recoiled, her heart thudding in her chest. I'm not Judy, stop calling me that. Her voice cracked, the frustration and fear boiling over. But Ben didn't flinch. His eyes bored into her, dark and vacant. You've always been Judy, he said, his tone as cold as ice. You just forgot. That night, as Emily lay in bed, her mind spiraled. She couldn't focus on anything, couldn't shake the feeling that reality itself was slipping away from her. Every time Ben called her Judy, it felt like a little piece of her was being stolen, replaced by something darker, something alien. She began digging through their old things, desperate for any kind of proof that she was losing her mind. She rifled through their wedding album, scanning each photo for the face she remembered. Her face? Emily's face. But each time she looked, something seemed off. Her reflection in the photos wasn't quite right. Was it the lighting? Or had her face changed? Was she remembering it wrong? The fear twisted inside her, a cold knot of panic that wouldn't unravel. Then one stormy evening, she found the album. It was tucked away in the attic, hidden beneath old clothes and forgotten boxes. The photo album was old, much older than anything they owned. As she opened it, a shiver ran down her spine. The first page was filled with grainy, black and white photos, images of a woman who looked disturbingly familiar. She turned the pages slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Each photo showed the same woman, posed in different places around the house. In some, she was smiling brightly. In others, her expression was distant, haunted. The resemblance was uncanny, and yet, this woman wasn't her. Her fingers hovered over a name written beneath the photographs in delicate cursive. Judy. Emily's pulse quickened, her mind racing. Who was this woman? She turned the pages faster, desperate for answers. As she did, the photos began to change. They grew darker, more ominous. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a hollow, vacant expression. Her once bright eyes looked empty, dead. Then, on the last page, Emily found a single photo that made her blood run cold. It was a picture of Ben, her Ben, standing in the kitchen, holding a woman by the hand. But it wasn't Emily, it was Judy. Emily stumbled back, her head spinning. This wasn't possible. Ben had never mentioned anyone named Judy. Who was this woman, and why did she look so much like Emily? The house, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every creak, every shadow seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not by Ben, but by something older, something rooted in the very walls of the home. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Judy hadn't left this place. She was still here, somewhere, somehow. Emily's mind raced with questions. Was Judy a ghost? A memory that refused to die? Or worse, was she becoming Judy? The fear gnawed at her, pulling her closer to the edge of sanity with each passing day. Finally, she confronted Ben, her voice barely above a whisper. Who was Judy? For a moment, Ben's expression softened. His eyes grew distant, almost sad. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Judy was my wife, he said quietly. A long time ago. Emily's heart skipped a beat. What happened to her? Ben's eyes darkened. She left. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unsaid truth. Emily could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her. Left? Or had something more sinister happened? She pressed further, her voice trembling. Did she live here? In this house? Ben looked at her, his gaze unreadable. Yes, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She did. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was the answer she had dreaded, the confirmation that something was horribly wrong. Judy had lived here. Judy had been her once. Emily spent the next few days in a haze of paranoia and dread. Every time she looked in the mirror, she feared she would see someone else staring back. Her reflection seemed strange, foreign, as though her features were subtly shifting, becoming someone else's. The memory lapses worsened. She began waking up in places she didn't remember going. Her reflection in the mirror became harder to recognize. She found herself staring at her face for long minutes, searching for traces of Emily and finding none. The lines between her and Judy were blurring, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on to who she was. Each time Ben called her Judy, it felt like a nail driven deeper into her identity. Was she still Emily? Or had she been Judy all along, just waiting to emerge? The tension in the house had grown unbearable, like the air had thickened, making it hard for Emily to breathe. The sense of being watched had transformed into something far more sinister. Now it felt like she wasn't just being watched, she was being replaced. Every time she caught her reflection in a mirror or a window, she felt like she was seeing someone else looking back. Days passed in a blur of terror, and Ben's behavior only grew more unnerving. He would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring out the window, murmuring under his breath. Sometimes Emily caught snippets of what he was saying, fragments of old conversations she didn't remember having. Conversations with Judy. One evening, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere any longer, Emily decided to confront Ben one last time. She had to get answers, no matter how terrifying they might be. She found him sitting in the living room, gazing into the flickering light of the television, which was tuned to static. His face was blank, lost in thought. Ben, she said, her voice tight with fear, tell me the truth. What happened to Judy? Ben turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker there. Remorse, maybe, or guilt. But it was gone before she could be sure. He sighed long and deep, as if he had been carrying a weight for far too long. Judy never left, he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost too calm. She's still here. Emily's blood ran cold. What do you mean, still here? Where is she? Ben's gaze drifted toward the hallway, his eyes unfocused. She's always been here, Emily. This house, it's hers. Emily felt the ground beneath her feet shift, as if the very foundation of her life had crumbled. That's not possible, she whispered, shaking her head. I'm your wife, Ben, not her. Ben stood up slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with an eerie intensity. You don't understand, do you? He said, his voice low and haunting. You are Judy. Emily recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest. No, she cried, her voice trembling. I'm Emily, I'm not. You were Emily once, Ben interrupted, his voice soft but insistent. But Judy, she never left. She's been waiting. She's been watching. Emily's mind reeled, the room spinning around her. You're lying, she whispered, more to herself than to him. This can't be happening. Ben stepped closer, his expression unreadable. I didn't want it to happen this way, he said almost apologetically. But it's the house. It's her. She won't let go. Emily stumbled back, her head swimming. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place. What did you do? She managed to choke out. Ben's eyes darkened. I didn't do anything, he whispered. It was always her. She's been waiting for you to remember, to come back. The words sent a wave of nausea through Emily. Her mind flashed back to the photo album she had found, the one with the grainy black and white images of Judy in every room of this house. The woman who looked so much like her. The woman who, in the later photos, had looked hollow, vacant. Emily's breath hitched in her throat as she realized the awful truth. She had been living Judy's life. This house, Ben, everything had been shaped around her, molding her into someone she wasn't, or was she? Ben, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. What happened to her? What happened to the real Judy? Ben's face remained blank, his expression devoid of emotion. Judy and I moved here years ago, he said quietly. This was supposed to be our home, but she changed. The house changed her, and one day she just disappeared. Emily's heart raced, the walls of the room seeming to close in around her. Disappeared? She echoed, her voice barely audible. She was gone, Ben continued, his voice hollow. One night I woke up and she wasn't there. I searched the house for hours, but she was nowhere to be found. No one could explain it. No one could help me. He paused, his eyes flicking toward the hallway again, as if he could see something there that Emily couldn't. But then you came, and I realized something. His voice dropped to a whisper. Judy wasn't gone. She was waiting for someone like you. Emily felt her knees buckle, her body swaying as the realization hit her with full force. She wasn't Emily anymore. She wasn't sure she had ever been. The house, the presence that lingered within it, had been molding her, shaping her into something else, into Judy. No, she whimpered, clutching her head in her hands. This isn't real. It can't be real. Ben's voice was soft, almost tender. It's real, Judy. It's always been real. Emily stumbled backward, desperate to get away from him, from the house, from everything that had twisted her life into this waking nightmare. She fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. As she passed the bathroom, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement in the mirror. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned to face the mirror, her heart pounding in her ears. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't her own. It was Judy. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and lifeless. Her lips twisted into a faint smile. The woman in the mirror looked at Emily with a cold, knowing moisses, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Waiting for Emily to realize the truth. Emily's hand shook as she reached up to touch her face, but the reflection didn't follow. Instead, Judy's hand pressed against the glass, her smile widening. Welcome home, the reflection whispered, though no sound escaped the mirror. Emily stumbled back, her mind unraveling. The truth clawed at her, ripping through her thoughts, tearing apart her sense of self. She had been losing herself for weeks, maybe longer. And now there was no escape. She was Judy. She had always been Judy. The house had made sure of that. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away from the bathroom mirror. Judy's reflection, her hollow eyes, her twisted smile, seemed to shimmer, fading slightly as Emily stepped into the shadowy hallway. The house had become a maze of distorted memories, of fear and confusion. Every corner, every creak of the floor felt like a part of some living, breathing thing, an entity that had swallowed her whole. She could feel her sanity fraying, unraveling thread by thread. Her only thought now was escape. She needed to leave the house, leave Ben, leave everything behind before it was too late. But was it already too late? Was there even a way out, or had she become trapped here, just as Judy had been before her? Emily bolted toward the front door, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors. As she reached for the doorknob, her hand trembled violently, her fingers barely able to grip the cold metal. She twisted it hard, pulling the door open with a surge of desperate hope. But what lay beyond the threshold wasn't the world she knew. Instead, it was darkness, a vast, endless void. No streetlights, no houses, no stars. Just black, yawning emptiness. The wind howled, a mournful, otherworldly sound that sent chills down her spine. She staggered back, slamming the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't the outside world. This wasn't an escape. The house, the thing that had taken hold of her life, wasn't letting her go. Panic clawed at her, the walls seeming to press in closer, suffocating her with their weight. Emily? Ben's voice drifted through the hallway, soft, coaxing. But there was something wrong about it. It didn't sound like him anymore. It was hollow, as if the house was speaking through him. "You can't leave." Her stomach twisted. She turned to see him standing in the hallway, watching her with that same unnerving calm, his hands at his sides, motionless. His eyes were dark, empty. "You belong here. With me. With her." Emily shook her head, her back pressed against the door, the cold metal of the doorknob digging into her spine. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not her. I'm not Judy. I'm Emily. I have to get out of here." But Ben's face remained emotionless. "You've always been Judy. You've just forgotten, but it's okay. You're home now." Something snapped inside Emily. The fear, the confusion. It all boiled over into raw terror. She bolted past Ben, her feet pounding against the floor as she raced toward the staircase. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to run as far as she could from the thing that her life had become. Her mind screamed for an escape, but every door, every window led nowhere. As she reached the top of the stairs, the walls seemed to stretch and distort, the ceiling lowering as if the house itself was closing in around her. The air was thick with that sickly floral scent, the perfume that had haunted her for weeks. It was everywhere now, suffocating her, pressing into her skin. She stumbled into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The room was eerily quiet, save for her own labored breathing. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room for any sign of hope, any sign of escape. But then she saw it. The mirror on the wall, the same mirror where she had first glimpsed Judy, was cracked, jagged lines spiderwebbing across its surface, and yet her reflection was whole. Judy stood there, her pale face staring back at Emily with that same cold, knowing smile. This time she wasn't trapped in the glass. She was coming through it. The crack widened, the glass warping and shimmering. Judy stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward Emily. "You can't run from me," Judy whispered, her voice a soft, chilling echo in the room. "This is my home, my life." Emily backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. No, I'm not you. I'm not." Judy's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a twisted kind of triumph. "You've always been me, Emily." Emily turned, desperately searching for something, anything that could free her from this nightmare. Her gaze fell on the bedside table. The perfume bottle, the one Ben had insisted was Judy's. It stood there, glowing faintly in the dim light, as if calling to her. In a moment of instinctive clarity, Emily lunged for the bottle. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she uncapped it and hurled the contents toward the mirror. The liquid splattered against the glass, hissing and bubbling as it made contact. Judy's smile faltered, her reflection flickering and distorting like a bad signal on a TV screen. The mirror began to crack further, splintering violently, shards falling to the floor as Judy's image twisted in agony. Her face contorted, her mouth opening in a silent scream as the glass shattered completely, sending pieces flying across the room. Emily collapsed to her knees, the sound of her own breathing filling the now silent space. The mirror was destroyed, Judy was gone, or so she thought. As she stood, trembling in the aftermath of the chaos, something shifted in the air. The heavy floral scent dissipated, replaced by the cool, familiar smell of the night. She turned toward the window, and this time, when she looked out, she saw the street. Her street. The world outside seemed real again. Relief flooded her body as she staggered toward the door. She opened it slowly, expecting another trick, another layer of the nightmare. But outside, everything was as it should be. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze. The street was quiet, peaceful. She stepped out into the fresh air, her chest heaving with the sheer magnitude of her escape. She was free. Or was she? As Emily walked down the path toward the gate, something caught her eye, a movement in the upstairs window. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat as she turned to look. There, standing in the window, was Ben, and beside him, Judy. Both of them stared down at her, their faces blank, their eyes dark and hollow. Emily's blood ran cold as they raised their hands in unison, waving slowly, deliberately. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and Emily felt the pull of the house again, that suffocating presence drawing her back in. She took a step forward, her mind screaming at her to turn around, to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. It was as if invisible hands were pulling her back toward the door, back toward the darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat as the house seemed to loom larger, the front door creaking open ever so slightly, as if inviting her back inside. And in that moment, Emily realized the awful truth. She had never really escaped. She had only taken Judy's place. The house was calling her home. The night was thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes even the slightest sound seem amplified in the quiet. Grace Hamilton, a weary single mother, glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 11:45 p.m. The day had been long, filled with the chaos of balancing work and caring for her 8-year-old son Ben. Now, as she settled onto the couch, the weight of fatigue pressed down on her eyelids. She had hoped for a peaceful evening, but the atmosphere in her home felt charged, as if the air itself was brimming with unspoken tension. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the telephone pierced the silence, making her jump. The sound reverberated through the house, a sharp contrast to the stillness outside. It was unusual for anyone to call at this hour, especially with the world wrapped in sleep. With hesitant steps, Grace walked toward the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. The caller ID showed a blocked number, causing a ripple of unease to wash over her. With a shaky breath, she picked up the receiver. "Hello," she said, her voice a whisper. On the other end, a low, distorted voice spoke, cutting through the night like a knife. "Whatever you do, don't go outside. Stay inside tonight." The words were urgent, laced with a palpable sense of dread. Grace felt a chill creep up her spine, her pulse quickening as the voice continued. "You don't understand. It's not safe. Just stay inside." Before she could respond, the line went dead, leaving her holding the phone, breathless and disoriented. Confusion washed over her, battling against the primal fear clawing at her insides. Was this a prank? The neighborhood was peaceful. Nothing ever happened in their small town. Yet, a growing instinct told her that this was serious. She glanced toward the stairs, where Ben slept soundly in his room, blissfully unaware of the unease creeping into her heart. Shaking off her fear, Grace moved through the house, securing the locks on the doors and windows, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the latches. The once familiar creaks of her home seemed louder now, echoing through the darkness. She could almost hear the pulse of her own heartbeat in the silence. Every shadow felt like a looming presence, and every gust of wind rattling the trees outside sent shivers down her spine. As she finished locking the last window, she stood in the dim light of the living room, glancing outside. The street was empty, the porch lights of the neighboring houses flickering sporadically like distant stars in a sky too close to touch. Grace's eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any signs of life. A fleeting movement caught her attention, a shadow darting between houses. It disappeared before she could make sense of it, leaving behind only an echo of unease. Then a low hum began to permeate the air, barely audible yet insistent, like the distant growl of an unseen beast. It seeped into her bones, wrapping around her like a thick fog, stirring a deep-seated fear she couldn't quite name. What was happening? Why did she feel as if the very air around her was alive with tension? As she moved to shut off the lights and settle in for a long, restless night, the phone rang again, slicing through the quiet like a jagged shard of glass. Her heart raced as she picked up the receiver, but this time there was no voice on the other end, only a deep, unending silence that stretched out like a chasm. Grace felt a suffocating weight in her chest as she placed the phone back on its cradle. The shadows outside seemed to deepen, and the hum grew louder, resonating within the walls of her home. She could no longer dismiss the feeling that something was out there, lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting for the night to unfold. With a final glance at the staircase, she moved to check on Ben, her heart pounding as she climbed the stairs. The house creaked beneath her feet, and the shadows danced in the flickering light. Each step felt heavy with the weight of impending dread, and she could almost hear the warning echoing in her mind. Stay inside. The air felt thick as molasses when Grace reached the top of the stairs, the soft glow from the nightlight casting elongated shadows along the hallway. She peeked into Ben's room, the door slightly ajar, revealing the peaceful rise and fall of his small body beneath the covers. The sight was comforting, yet a gnawing anxiety tugged at her heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurked just beyond their walls. As she turned to head back downstairs, a loud knock shattered the fragile calm of the night, echoing through the silent house. Grace's heart raced, pounding in her ears like a war drum. Who could it be at this hour? She glanced back at Ben's room, the shadows shifting ominously as if they had a life of their own. With hesitant steps, she made her way toward the door, her pulse quickening with each step. Peering through the peephole, she saw a figure, her neighbor Sarah, standing on the porch, her face pale and drawn, her hair disheveled as if she had just run a marathon. Something in her expression screamed urgency and fear. Grace hesitated, remembering the warning from the anonymous caller. But the instinct to help outweighed her fear. She unlocked the door, pulling it open just wide enough to let Sarah slip inside. The moment Sarah crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It felt as if a storm cloud had rolled in, dark and oppressive. "Thank God," Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who else to turn to. Something's not right." Grace shut the door behind her, the sound echoing like a tomb sealing shut. "What happened?" she asked, her heart pounding in time with the low hum that had intensified, vibrating against her skin. "I got the same call," Sarah explained, her eyes darting toward the windows, wide with panic. "I thought it was a joke, but then I heard it. It sounded like a chant, almost. I felt like something was watching me." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment they stood in shared silence, the weight of unspoken fears hanging heavily between them. With a flicker of movement outside, Grace stepped closer to the window, peering through the thin curtains. The street seemed deserted, but an unsettling sense of presence made her skin prickle. Her gaze fell on their neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, standing on his porch, staring into the darkness with an unblinking gaze. His eyes seemed vacant, devoid of the warmth she had always known. "Sarah, look," she whispered, pointing outside. Sarah leaned in, and they both watched as Mr. Jenkins began to sway, a marionette tangled in its strings, his movements jerky and unnatural. Suddenly, he turned and began to approach their house, each step slow yet deliberate. Grace felt a shiver of fear snake down her spine, and the room grew colder. "He looks different," she whispered, her throat tight. "Maybe we should call for help," Sarah suggested, but her voice wavered, uncertainty creeping in. Before they could react, Ben's sleepwalking figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway, his small body moving mechanically toward the front door. "Ben!" Grace shouted, her heart racing as she rushed toward him. But it was as if an invisible force was pulling him, the doorknob glinting seductively in the low light. Grace lunged forward, grabbing his arm just as his fingers brushed the cold metal. The moment she touched him, a violent surge of energy coursed through her as if the house itself was alive, fighting against her. "Mom?" Ben murmured, his eyes glazed over, not quite aware of the danger that surrounded them. "Stay away from the door!" Grace yelled, her heart pounding as she felt a pressure pushing against her back, as if something were trying to shove her aside. Sarah rushed to help, gripping Ben's other arm, but he twisted away, drawn toward the door like a moth to a flame. The weight of the unseen force pressed heavily against them, like a wall of dread that threatened to crush their spirits. "Something's outside?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising in panic. They wrestled with Ben, trying to pull him away from the doorknob, but it felt like they were fighting against the very foundation of their home. "We need to get him away from there." Just then, the front door rattled violently, echoing through the house as if something powerful was trying to break in. The hum outside swelled to a deafening roar, filling their heads with a cacophony of whispers that seemed to taunt them. "We're not safe here," Grace gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Suddenly, the door swung open with a thunderous crash, sending a jolt of fear through them. But instead of darkness, a chilling wind swept into the room, a phantom presence that felt both ancient and alive. The figures outside shifted in the periphery of her vision, their forms indistinct yet undeniably threatening, as if they were waiting for an invitation to enter. "Get back!" Grace screamed, shoving Ben and Sarah away from the door as the air thickened with an unnatural energy. But they were trapped in their own sanctuary, the familiar walls of their home now feeling more like a cage than a haven. The house seemed to breathe around them, a living entity pulsating with a dark hunger, and they were caught in its grasp. In that moment of chaos, as the world outside began to dissolve into shadows and echoes, Grace realized they were no longer just dealing with an unseen threat. They were entwined in something far darker, something that sought to pull them apart, to keep them held back from the truth lurking in the night. The oppressive atmosphere hung thick in the air as Grace, Sarah, and Ben stood together in the living room, hearts racing, eyes darting toward the open front door. The shadows outside writhed and twisted in the dim light, shapes moving in a disjointed dance that felt otherworldly, each flicker of movement sending a new surge of dread through their veins. As they huddled together, Grace felt an unsettling chill sweep through the house, a sudden drop in temperature that felt unnatural and suffocating. It was as if the very walls were absorbing the warmth of their bodies, leaving them exposed to the cold embrace of something sinister lurking just beyond their reach. Every creak of the floorboards echoed in the tense silence, a reminder of the impending doom. "Close the door!" Sarah shouted, her voice laced with panic as she pushed against Ben, trying to shield him from the menacing sight outside. But the door seemed to resist her command, swaying as if caught in a struggle of its own. Each time Grace attempted to shut it, an invisible force pressed back, forcing her to grapple with the unsettling reality that they were trapped in a house that no longer felt like home. Ben, still in a trance-like state, stood in the middle of the room, his small figure frozen as if he were caught in a spell. "They're waiting for you," he muttered, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. Grace felt a chill run down her spine, the boy's words wrapping around her mind like a vice. It was as if the house had a connection to him, feeding off his innocence, pulling him deeper into its dark web. "Ben, come here," Grace pleaded, her heart racing. The shadows outside began to shift closer, and with them came a low, rhythmic thumping that reverberated through the air, building in intensity until it felt like a heartbeat. It was as if something was alive out there, and it was hungry. "Stay away from the door," Grace cried, her voice rising above the chaos. But the shadows outside pulsed and swayed, almost mocking her. The low hum that had filled the air morphed into something darker, a chorus of whispers that seeped into her thoughts, murmuring things she couldn't quite comprehend, yet resonating with a primal fear deep within her. "Grace, look!" Sarah pointed to the window, her voice trembling. Grace turned her gaze toward the glass and gasped. Outside, the figures had multiplied, moving in erratic, unnatural patterns. They were no longer just shadows. They were distinct, their forms flickering like old film, faces obscured but filled with a palpable malice. They were alive, and they were waiting, stretching their arms toward the house, reaching for them. Grace backed away, pulling Ben closer as she felt a surge of desperation. "We have to leave. We can't stay here." But as she moved toward the hallway, a sudden wave of resistance washed over her, pinning her feet to the floor as if the very fabric of the house was holding her back. The walls felt alive, pulsating with energy, and the temperature plummeted further. Grace glanced at Sarah, who was now shaking with fear, eyes wide as she tried to process the scene unfolding before them. The pressure in the air was suffocating, making it hard to breathe as the whispers grew louder, almost forming words that slithered into Grace's mind. "Listen to us," they seemed to say. "Stay, you're safe here." But Grace knew better. The feeling of safety had long since evaporated, replaced by an undeniable sense of dread that consumed her thoughts. "We need to find a way out," she insisted, trying to pull Ben with her, but he was still rooted to the spot, his small body shaking slightly as he stared into the darkness beyond the door. Suddenly the door slammed shut, vibrating with a force that sent a shockwave through the house. Grace stumbled back, her heart racing as she realized they were truly trapped. The once familiar sound of the door closing felt like the final nail in the coffin, sealing them in a tomb of their own making. "Ben!" Sarah cried out, rushing to his side, but as she touched him, her hand recoiled. He felt colder than ever, as if the very essence of warmth had been drained from him. Grace reached out, trying to pull her son back into her embrace, but it felt like grasping at smoke. Each time she tried, it was as if he slipped further away, caught in the invisible web woven by the dark forces surrounding them. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers now a cacophony of voices that filled the room with an overwhelming sense of despair. Grace could feel them digging into her thoughts, planting seeds of doubt and fear, taunting her with the knowledge that escape was no longer an option. She pressed her hands against her head, trying to block out the invasive sound, but it only grew louder, a relentless tide of darkness washing over her. In a moment of desperation, Grace turned to the window, determined to find another way out. But as she approached, she felt an electric jolt of energy coursing through the air, forcing her back as if a barrier had risen to keep her contained. The glass shimmered with an unearthly light, distorting the world outside. The figures that had once seemed distant were now pressing against the invisible barrier, their faces contorted in agony, mouths moving silently as they reached out toward her. "Please, let us out," Grace screamed, feeling the weight of hopelessness crash down around her. But her cries were swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the oppressive silence that followed. The shadows outside pulsed with energy, and she knew deep down, that something terrible was about to happen. Just then, Ben turned to her, his expression shifting from vacant to something darker. "They want you, Mom," he said in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. It sent a jolt of fear through her heart racing as she realized that whatever had taken hold of her son was deeper than she could have ever imagined. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about being outside or trapped in the house. They were ensnared in something ancient and malevolent, forces that reached beyond their understanding, pulling them apart, feeding off their fear and despair. The house no longer felt like a shelter. It had become a vessel for the darkness, and they were its prey. As the shadows pressed closer, enveloping Grace, Ben, and Sarah in a suffocating blanket of dread, an ominous realization settled heavily in the air. This was not merely a case of being trapped in their home, but rather they were caught in the throes of something sinister. An ancient malevolence that thrived on their fear, growing stronger with every moment they resisted. Ben stood eerily still, his eyes glazed over, a thin veil of something otherworldly reflecting in their depths. "They want you to join them," he murmured, the words slithering from his lips like a serpent, cold and calculating. Grace felt her stomach twist, dread coiling tightly around her heart as she processed the implications of his words. The connection between Ben and the forces outside was deepening, and she could sense that time was running out. Desperation fueled her resolve. "Ben, listen to me," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she stepped toward him. "You have to fight it. You're stronger than this." But the shadows began to swirl around him, whispering their dark promises, luring him into their depths. Grace could feel the cold energy radiating off him, pulling her closer like a gravitational force, and she fought against the invisible tendrils reaching for her. "Mom, I can see them," Ben said, his voice now layered with an unsettling distortion. "They're so sad. They don't want to hurt you, but they need you." His small body seemed to shudder, as if caught in a struggle between two realms. The warm, familiar love of his mother and the cold, consuming darkness that beckoned him. "Stay away from them, Ben!" Grace screamed, desperation clawing at her throat as she reached out to him, her hands trembling with fear. The shadows danced around him, swirling with an eerie, magnetic pull that threatened to consume his very essence. "You're my son. You don't belong to them." Just then, Sarah, still reeling from the mounting tension, clutched Grace's arm, her face pale. "We have to do something. We can't let them take him." Her voice wavered, but the fire in her eyes sparked something in Grace. They needed to break the hold, to reclaim Ben from the grasp of the darkness that sought to swallow him whole. In a moment of clarity, Grace realized that it wasn't just Ben they were trying to save. It was their collective strength that would shield them from the overwhelming tide of fear. "Ben, you're not alone," Grace shouted, her voice fierce, cutting through the whispers like a sword. "We love you. Remember the camping trip? The stars we saw? We're right here with you." For a heartbeat, time suspended as Ben's eyes flickered, confusion breaking through the suffocating haze. The shadows momentarily receded, and Grace saw a glimmer of her son peeking through the storm. She took a step closer, feeling the air crackle with tension. "Fight it, baby. Come back to us." The shadows writhed angrily, a deep, guttural growl emanating from them reverberating through the house. The whispers turned to screeches, a chorus of rage that filled the air, shaking the very foundation of their home. Grace pressed forward, refusing to back down, anchoring herself to the love she had for her son. With Sarah's hand gripping her shoulder, they stood united against the encroaching darkness, channeling their combined strength. "We're not afraid of you," Sarah shouted, her voice rising defiantly. The shadows hissed, momentarily taken aback by their defiance. And in that flicker of hesitation, Grace felt a surge of hope. But just as the tide began to shift, a figure emerged from the shadows, a grotesque amalgamation of faces and forms. It stood towering before them, eyes glinting with malevolence, its presence more suffocating than before. Grace's breath hitched in her throat as the entity spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that slithered through her mind. "You cannot escape your fate. He belongs to us." In that moment of horror, the reality of their situation crystallized. The entity was not just an embodiment of fear, it was the manifestation of all their anxieties, their regrets, and their unspoken fears. It fed on the darkness in their hearts, growing stronger with every moment of doubt. Just then, Ben snapped back to reality, shaking violently as if waking from a nightmare. "Mom, I can't hold it back," he screamed, terror etched across his innocent face. "Help me!" Grace lunged forward, wrapping her arms around him as the shadows surged, attempting to pull him away. But instead of resisting, she chose to embrace the fear head-on. "We're stronger together, Ben. Fight back with me." She closed her eyes and anchoring herself in the memories of laughter, love, and safety they had built together. In an instant, a blinding light erupted from their joined hands, illuminating the room as the shadows recoiled, screeching in fury. The warmth enveloped them, pushing back the darkness that threatened to consume them. "You are loved!" Grace shouted, the words resonating with an undeniable strength that shattered the choking grip of despair. As the light intensified, the shadows began to unravel, their forms dissipating like smoke in the wind. The entity wailed, its shape twisting and contorting, losing its hold as Grace and Ben stood firm against the encroaching void. "You will never have him," Grace yelled, her voice rising above the cacophony filled with fierce determination. In that climactic moment, the house shuddered, walls vibrating with a primal energy as the darkness finally retreated, pulled away by the force of their united love. Ben collapsed into Grace's arms, shaking yet alive with renewed strength, and she held him tightly, feeling his warmth return. The room settled into silence, the oppressive weight lifting as the shadows melted away, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the now closed door. They had fought back the darkness, but the toll it took left an indelible mark on their souls, a reminder that fear is a living thing, lurking in the corners, waiting for an opportunity to break through. With trembling hands, Grace pulled back to look into Ben's eyes, relief flooding through her as she saw the warmth and clarity returning to his gaze. "We did it," she whispered, tears of gratitude spilling down her cheeks. But as the three of them stood together, shaking and breathless, the haunting realization settled in their hearts. Although they had escaped the immediate danger, they knew that the darkness would always linger at the edges, a shadow waiting for another moment of weakness. The night had changed them forever, binding their fates together in an unbreakable chain forged by love, fear, and the haunting memory of what lurked just outside their door. The oppressive silence that followed the confrontation was a double-edged sword, a bittersweet balm against the chaos they had just survived. Grace, Sarah, and Ben stood huddled together in the living room, the remnants of the darkness still hanging in the air like a heavy mist. Though the shadows had receded, their absence created a void that felt just as ominous. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she scanned the dimly lit room, half expecting the shadows to rear their heads once more. Grace held Ben tightly against her chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her palm, a reassuring rhythm that anchored her in this newfound calm. "I think so," Grace replied, her voice shaky but resolute. "But we need to stay vigilant. We can't let our guard down." A sense of unease gnawed at her, the lingering echoes of fear still whispering in the corners of her mind. The light that had once illuminated their surroundings began to flicker, casting elongated shadows that danced along the walls, and Grace felt the chill creep back into her bones. "Mom, I don't like this," Ben said softly, looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes that were still filled with the remnants of terror. She brushed his hair back, forcing a smile even as her heart raced with unease. "I know, sweetheart. Just stick close to me." They retreated into the kitchen, seeking the warmth of familiarity in the soft glow of the overhead light. The comforting smell of the coffee pot lingered in the air, grounding them momentarily in a sense of normalcy. But as Grace moved to pour herself a cup, a faint crackling sound cut through the silence, a static that felt unnatural, like an impending storm brewing on the horizon. The noise grew louder, an unsettling whisper that seemed to slither into the room, wrapping around them like a tightening noose. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting toward the window, where the night outside seemed to pulse with a dark energy. "It's just the radio," Grace replied, though doubt laced her words. She approached the kitchen counter, but the static intensified, distorting the familiar sounds of their home into something haunting and alien. The coffee pot began to tremble, the vibrations radiating through the countertop, echoing the heartbeats of fear thudding in their chests. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the kitchen into darkness before sputtering back to life. And when they did, the reflection in the window caught Grace's eye, a figure standing just outside, shrouded in darkness, watching them with unblinking intensity. "Who's there?" she called out, heart pounding, but no response came. Instead, the figure shifted, melting into the shadows like smoke, only to reappear closer, standing just beyond the glass. Grace's breath hitched as she recognized the familiar shape. Their next-door neighbor, Mr. Jenkins. But he was different now. His features were twisted, grotesque, and hollow, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, filled with an abyss of despair. "Help me," he whispered, voice distorted, barely making it through the glass. Panic rose in her throat, and she shook her head, backing away as she felt Ben's small hand clutching at her leg. "Mom, I don't want to see that," he cried, burying his face against her. But she couldn't tear her gaze away. The shadows behind Mr. Jenkins writhed, whispering promises of salvation that clawed at her mind, making her question her sanity. "Grace, close the curtains." Sarah shouted, her voice sharp with urgency, and with shaking hands, Grace turned to obey, drawing the fabric across the window, cutting off the sight of the twisted figure. But the static grew louder, thrumming like a heartbeat, reverberating through the very core of the house. "I don't think we're safe," Sarah said, fear threading through her words. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of dread settle over them once more. "We need to find a way out of here." She turned to Ben, her heart aching at the fear etched across his small face. "We're going to be okay. I promise." As they moved toward the door, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the room into utter darkness. Grace felt a primal fear clawing at her chest, her instincts screaming that they needed to escape. "Stay close," she urged, holding on to Ben as they groped their way through the shadows, the air thickening with the stench of something foul and decaying. Just then the door swung open with a deafening crash, revealing an expanse of swirling darkness beyond. The world outside had transformed, the familiar street now cloaked in an inky blackness, swirling with malevolence. A chorus of whispers surged through the air, beckoning them to come outside, promising safety and freedom. "No!" Grace shouted, gripping Ben tighter as he tried to pull away, drawn by the allure of the unknown. "Stay with me!" The darkness crept into the house, wrapping around their feet, as if the very ground beneath them was shifting, pulling them toward the threshold. "Mom!" Ben cried out, panic rising in his voice. "They're here! I can see them!" He pointed toward the open door, and Grace turned just in time to see silhouettes forming in the doorway, stepping forward with fluid grace, their features indistinguishable yet full of dark intent. "Let go of him!" Sarah yelled, shoving past Grace as she lunged for Ben, but the shadows surged, wrapping around Sarah like a vice, pulling her backward. "Help, Grace!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the darkness as she vanished from sight. "No!" Grace screamed, adrenaline surging through her as she fought against the darkness. But it was too late. The shadows were too strong, overwhelming her senses, dragging her into a void where reality bent and twisted. With a desperate scream, Grace felt the floor drop away beneath hers, plummeting into an abyss that echoed with Sarah's fading cries. "Ben!" she shouted, reaching for her son, who stood frozen in fear, caught between the light of his mother and the darkness that beckoned. But as she fell into the depths, an unearthly realization washed over her. This was not just about escaping the house. It was about confronting the very essence of their fears, the things they had buried deep within their hearts. As the darkness swallowed her whole, Grace felt a surge of clarity. She had to face the entity that had been lurking in the corners of their lives, feeding on their doubts and fears. "I'm not afraid of you," she roared, her voice echoing in the void, the shadows shuddering at her defiance. With that final act of rebellion, the darkness roared back, the whispers turning into a cacophony of rage as the walls of her consciousness began to unravel. The shadows coalesced into a swirling vortex around her, and she felt Ben's hand slip from her grasp, but she clung to the belief that love was stronger than fear. Just then, she broke through the surface, bursting back into the living room where they had all gathered, the flickering lights returning to life as if mocking her descent into the abyss. The familiar scent of coffee wafted through the air, but the warmth felt hollow. "Ben!" Grace gasped, falling to her knees as she searched the room, heart racing. He stood there, wide-eyed and trembling, surrounded by the swirling shadows that now crept along the edges of the room, threatening to pull them back into the dark. "Mom!" he cried, and with that, the connection sparked back to life. Grace shot forward, wrapping her arms around him, grounding them both against the creeping darkness. "We can't let them take you," she said fiercely, her voice steady. And then it happened. A blinding light erupted from their joined hands, illuminating the room as the shadows writhed and shrieked, retreating from the warmth of their love. "Together!" Grace shouted, and they summoned every ounce of strength they had left, pushing against the darkness that threatened to pull them apart. With a final deafening roar, the shadows shrieked, unraveling like thread pulled from fabric, vanishing into nothingness as the light filled the room. Grace could feel the oppressive weight lifting, the air returning to a warm, familiar embrace. As the last remnants of darkness dissolved, Grace pulled Ben closer, breathing in the scent of his hair, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. They were safe, at least for now. But as she turned to Sarah, who emerged from the shadows, her eyes wide with shock, Grace understood that the horrors they had faced had left an indelible mark on their souls. The world outside remained unchanged, but they had changed irrevocably, their bonds stronger yet scarred by the terrifying experience. "Are you okay?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "I thought we lost you." I'm here," Sarah replied, though her face was pale, reflecting the turmoil within. "But what about the darkness? What if it comes back?" Grace nodded, knowing in her heart that it would always linger, an unwelcome specter at the edges of their reality. "Then we'll face it together. We'll never let it take us again." In that moment of solidarity, they embraced, the flickering light casting shadows that danced along the walls, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the strength they had found in each other. They would stand united against the shadows, ready to confront whatever horrors awaited them in the night. As they moved to close the story begins innocently, with the narrator recalling his once peaceful, happy life. His wife was the kind of woman who made the house feel warm, and their son, still young and full of life, completed the perfect picture of a family. Everything seemed right, but as with all horrors, it didn't begin with an explosion, it started with a whisper. One morning, the narrator wakes up, the sun just breaking through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. His wife is already out of bed, a habit that had become common recently. Her absence no longer struck him as strange, just something to be brushed aside as part of their busy lives. But as he stumbles into the kitchen, he catches her standing at the counter, her back turned. There's nothing overtly wrong with the scene. She's making breakfast, their son babbling in his high chair. But something feels off. It's the way she moves, robotic, like she's just going through the motions. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, but her response is delayed, as if she hadn't heard him at first. "Of course." She smiles, but it doesn't reach her eyes. It's a tiny moment, but it sticks with him. Over the next few days, these small oddities begin to multiply. She starts spacing out during conversations, staring at their son for minutes at a time without blinking, as if she's looking through him. At night, she's restless. The narrator wakes up to find her standing at the window, staring out into the darkness, her silhouette rigid and unmoving. When he asks what's wrong, she always replies with a soft, distant voice, "Just couldn't sleep." At first, he dismisses it. After all, everyone has rough patches. But it doesn't stop. It gets worse. Then there's the first real incident. One night, the narrator wakes suddenly, the air in the room feeling unnaturally cold. He turns over, expecting to find his wife asleep beside him, but the bed is empty. Quietly, he walks through the dark house, a strange sense of dread building in his chest. When he reaches their son's room, he hears it, the low murmur of his wife's voice, speaking softly in the dark. He pushes the door open just a crack, enough to peer inside. There she is, sitting at the foot of their son's crib, her head slightly bowed, whispering something too faint for him to hear clearly. But there's something disturbing about the scene. She's not touching their son, not interacting with him in any way. She's just sitting there, whispering. And the worst part, their son is staring back at her, wide-eyed and silent. When he finally steps into the room, the floorboard creaks, and she abruptly stops. Her head turns slowly toward him, her eyes reflecting the dim glow of the hallway light. She stands up without a word, walking past him like nothing unusual had happened. He looks down at their son, who is now fast asleep, as if none of it ever occurred. The narrator's heart pounds in his chest. He tries to shake the feeling, but he can't. He doesn't want to overreact. It could just be a moment of sleep deprivation, stress, something logical. But the unease lingers, gnawing at him, and it's from this moment that the first seed of fear is planted. As the days pass, his wife's behavior becomes more erratic, but always in subtle ways. She continues her routines as a mother and wife, but there's a growing distance in her eyes, a detachment that wasn't there before. At times, when the narrator tries to speak to her, it's as if she's hearing him from far away. Her response is delayed, her voice hollow. It's unnerving, this quiet transformation, as though the woman he married is slowly slipping away without a clear cause. The house itself starts to feel different too. Places that once felt warm and comforting now hold an odd stillness. Shadows seem longer, the air heavier. The child's room in particular feels off. He's begun waking up in the night, crying out, but by the time the narrator gets there, he's asleep again, calm, as if nothing had happened. The narrator tries to ignore these things, but the feeling is relentless, slowly eating at him. Something isn't right with his wife. He tells himself it's just stress or exhaustion, but deep down he knows it's something more, something darker. One evening after a long day at work, the narrator comes home to find the house unusually quiet. His wife is sitting in the living room, their son playing quietly at her feet. When he walks in, she doesn't look up, doesn't even acknowledge his presence. He speaks her name, but she remains frozen, staring at their son in that same unnerving way. He steps closer and places his hand on her shoulder, his voice tight with worry. "Are you okay?" She slowly turns her head toward him, her eyes dull and distant. Her lips part, and in a low, almost monotone voice, she whispers, "He's special, you know. I think someone wants him." His blood runs cold. And just like that, she blinks, her eyes clear again, and she smiles, warm, familiar, as if she hadn't just said the most chilling thing he's ever heard. "What did you say?" He stammers, but she looks confused, like she doesn't remember. "I didn't say anything," she replies softly. But he knows something is deeply, terribly wrong. The unsettling behaviors from his wife have continued to grow, but in ways that are hard to fully articulate. She still moves through their life together as though she is the same person, but something is wrong, and that feeling gnaws at him day and night. It's no longer just subtle unease, it's unmistakable now. The first clear sign that something is terribly wrong happens when the narrator comes home from work late one evening. The house is quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. As he walks into the hallway, he notices the door to their son's room is slightly ajar, and a thin strip of light leaks out into the dark corridor. His footsteps are cautious, as if his body knows before his mind does that something waits for him inside. He opens the door to find his wife sitting on the floor, cross-legged, in front of the crib. Their son is fast asleep, but her focus is unnervingly intense, almost like she's studying him. Her lips move, but no sound escapes. She's muttering silently, her hands folded in her lap, completely still otherwise. "What are you doing?" he asks, his voice tense, but she doesn't respond. He takes a step closer, and that's when she turns, her eyes wide, as if she's startled by his presence. She smiles, but it's not a smile of warmth. It's forced, mechanical. "I'm just watching over him," she says softly, standing up without another word and brushing past him. Gaslighting and erosion of trust. From that point forward, the wife begins to pull away emotionally, but in such a subtle way that the narrator can barely pinpoint what's happening. When he tries to talk to her about her strange behavior, she brushes it off with a calm, almost patronizing tone, as though he's the one overreacting. Each time he brings up his concerns, she dismisses him with such chilling ease that he starts doubting his own perception. "You're just tired," she says with a soft smile. "You've been working so hard. Of course, you're going to feel a little off." She twists reality, making him question if he's imagining things. Every strange encounter is smoothed over with excuses that seem logical but hollow. And each time she does it, he feels more isolated, more unsure of his own mind. Things take a darker turn when the wife starts spending more time in their son's room, often locking the door behind her. The narrator begins to notice patterns in her behavior. Rituals, almost. She cleans the room obsessively, rearranging the furniture over and over, always in the same configuration. She begins whispering to their son before bed, lingering for much longer than necessary, her words low and incomprehensible. The narrator stands outside the door, listening to her murmur strange phrases like a mantra, his skin crawling with every word. One night, after she's tucked their son in and left the room, he sneaks in to check on his child. The room feels different, charged with something oppressive. On the floor, he notices something new, a series of small marks, almost invisible unless you're looking closely. Symbols drawn in a strange, jagged pattern surrounding the crib. His heart races and he scrubs at the marks with his hands, trying to erase them. When he confronts her, asking what they mean, she looks at him with the same cold, distant expression and says, "It's just for protection. Don't you want to keep him safe?" Psychological manipulation. The narrator's world starts to fragment. Each time he tries to bring up these incidents, his wife's calm demeanor unnerves him further. She never raises her voice, never becomes defensive. Instead, she speaks to him as if he's the one losing his grip. Her tone is always measured, her words just reasonable enough to make him doubt himself. "You've been so stressed, I understand, but don't you think you're overthinking this?" She uses their past love against him, reminding him of how close they once were, as if trying to lull him back into the comfort of their former life. But every word feels hollow, like a mask barely concealing something else underneath. Creepy signs in the house. As the narrator's anxiety increases, he starts to notice small, eerie details around the house that he hadn't before. Their son's favorite toys begin appearing in strange places, like the kitchen counter or by the front door, even though no one had touched them. Sometimes he finds them arranged in odd patterns, their positions too deliberate to be accidents. He dismisses these incidents at first, but the feeling of being watched, even in his own home, grows stronger by the day. His son's behavior begins to change too. He starts waking up at night, his cries sharp and filled with panic. But by the time the narrator reaches him, his child is sound asleep again, the house quiet once more. Each time, the narrator's nerves fray a little more, the tension becoming. Desperate for answers and unable to confront his wife directly, the narrator decides to set up a hidden camera in their son's room. He can't shake the feeling that whatever is happening is tied to those late-night whispers and strange rituals she performs by their child's bedside. He hides the camera high up on a shelf, ensuring it has a clearer view of the crib. The act of installing it fills him with guilt. This is his wife, after all, but the dread gnawing at him has grown too strong to ignore. For the next few days, he tries to act normal, but every moment is a battle against the anxiety creeping in. His wife remains eerily calm, moving through her days as though nothing is amiss. But the narrator knows better now. Each time she enters their son's room at night, he feels a sickening twist in his gut, waiting for the morning when he can review the footage. Finally, after several nights, he sits alone in their dimly lit living room, his laptop open on his knees, ready to see what the camera has captured. His hands tremble as he clicks through the footage, the familiar sight of his wife tucking their son in, kissing him on the forehead, and sitting at his bedside playing out on the screen. At first, everything seems ordinary, almost comforting in its normalcy. But then he notices something. The footage shows his wife sitting by the crib, her back to the camera, just as he's seen her countless times. But this time, there's something different about her posture. She's too still, too rigid. Her head is slightly bowed, her hands placed flat on her knees. The room around her seems to darken, the shadows pulling in as if the light itself is being devoured. Then she begins to whisper. The words are soft, almost inaudible at first, but the camera picks up just enough for him to hear. It's not English. It's not any language he's ever heard. Her voice grows louder, more deliberate, the tone rhythmic, as if she's reciting something ancient, something meant to stay hidden. He leans in closer to the screen, his heart pounding, trying to make sense of the sounds spilling from her lips. Then she stands, moving toward their son's crib. His pulse quickens as she reaches down, placing her hands on the child's chest, her voice now a steady chant. The camera's night vision casts an eerie glow over the scene, and for the first time, the narrator notices something he hadn't before. Symbols drawn in the air above their son, her fingers tracing invisible lines with practiced precision. The narrator's breath catches in his throat as a realization strikes him. This isn't just strange behavior. This is deliberate. It's a ritual. Then it happens. As her chanting intensifies, something changes in the room. The very air seems to thicken, as though a presence is descending upon the space. The shadows near the crib seem to writhe and twist unnaturally, pooling into a shape, something that doesn't belong in this world. He stares in horror as the camera glitches momentarily, static breaking up the image, and when it clears again, he sees it. Something crouched at the edge of the crib, barely visible but undeniably there. Its form is dark, too dark to be a trick of the light, and it moves with a fluid, unnatural grace, almost blending into the shadows but with a presence that chills him to his core. It watches their son. His wife doesn't react to the figure. In fact, she continues her ritual, seemingly calling it forth. The thing leans closer to their child, who is still sound asleep, oblivious to the horror that has crept into his room. The narrator is paralyzed by fear, watching as his wife murmurs one final phrase, her voice unnervingly low, almost guttural now. And with those words, the thing by the crib seems to dissolve, its form vanishing back into the darkness. But the air in the room remains thick with its presence. His wife calmly leaves the room as though nothing unusual has happened. The narrator's hands are shaking as he closes the laptop. His heart races, his mind struggling to process what he's just seen. His wife isn't just distant or lost in some mental fog. She's part of something far darker, something malevolent, and worse, she's dragging their son into it. He feels the bile rise in his throat as he rushes to confront her. He finds her in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepares dinner, her movements slow and deliberate. The sight of her now fills him with cold revulsion, knowing what she's been doing while their son sleeps. "What did you do to him?" he demands, his voice shaking with barely contained terror. She turns, her face completely calm, the same serene expression she's always worn. "I'm protecting him," she says softly, as if the words are obvious. "From what?" he spits, his voice rising. "What was that thing in his room?" Her smile doesn't waver, but her eyes darken, something cold and calculating shifting behind them. "You don't understand," she says, stepping closer. "I'm doing what's best for him." He backs away instinctively, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before him. This isn't his wife. It's as if the woman he married has been consumed by something else, something that wears her face but speaks with a voice that isn't hers. From that moment on, the narrator's world spirals out of control. He watches her constantly, terrified of what she'll do next. Every time she's alone with their son, his heart races, but he's helpless to stop her. His wife begins spending even more time locked in their child's room, performing rituals he no longer has to witness to know are happening. The tension in the house becomes suffocating, every shadow thick with the presence of something unseen but deeply malevolent. His son begins talking in his sleep, muttering things no child should know, phrases that mirror the strange chants his wife whispers at night. The narrator's grip on his own sanity weakens with each passing day, his fear for his son's safety consuming him. The story reaches its horrifying climax one fateful night. The narrator wakes to the sound of soft, rhythmic chanting again, but this time something is different. The air feels colder, heavier than ever before. His heart pounds in his chest as he races down the hall to his son's room, only to find the door locked. He bangs on it, shouting her name, demanding she let him in. There's no response at first, just that horrible, low whispering behind the door. Finally, the lock clicks and the door creaks open. His wife stands in the middle of the room, her face a mask of eerie calm, their son lying peacefully in the crib behind her. But the atmosphere in the room is wrong. The air is thick with a presence that is almost tangible, like a dark veil hanging over everything. "He's mine now," she says softly, her voice no longer her own. The narrator is frozen in terror. Something has claimed his wife, and now it's coming for his son. He knows in that instant that he must make a choice, to confront her and whatever dark force is controlling her, or take his son and run, knowing that this horror may never truly leave them. It's the middle of the night when the narrator wakes with a start, a cold sweat coating his skin. The house is silent, too silent. He glances over to his wife's side of the bed, but she's not there. His stomach drops as he hears a faint, muffled noise coming from their son's room, like soft chanting, familiar and chilling. This time there's no hesitation. He rushes down the hallway, his heart pounding louder with each step. He reaches the door to his son's room and pushes it open, but what he sees freezes him in place. His wife is standing over the crib, but this time she's not alone. The dark figure, the one he had seen on the hidden camera, is back. But now it's clearer, more defined. It hovers just above their son, its shadowy form stretching unnaturally, like a predator about to strike. The room is filled with an oppressive, suffocating darkness, and the air feels thick, almost toxic. His wife's eyes are wide and glassy, her lips moving rapidly in a language he still can't understand. "What are you doing?" he shouts, his voice breaking the heavy silence. But she doesn't answer. Instead, she turns slowly to face him, her expression blank, her eyes devoid of any emotion. She speaks, but her voice is no longer hers. It's deeper, more guttural, as if something else is speaking through her. "It has to be done," she says calmly, the words sending a chill down his spine. He's been chosen. The dark figure shifts, its form twisting like smoke, reaching toward their son, whose tiny chest rises and falls in peaceful sleep, oblivious to the nightmare happening around him. The narrator's blood runs cold. Whatever this thing is, it's about to take his child. "Get away from him," he screams, rushing forward. But his wife steps between him and the crib, blocking his path. Her expression is eerily calm, as though she doesn't see the horror unfolding behind her, as though she's accepted it. "This is what needs to happen," she whispers, her voice filled with a strange, eerie certainty. "He'll be safe. I prepared him. You don't understand." Her voice, once so familiar, now feels like a stranger's, detached, empty. The narrator's mind races, his body trembling with fear. He can't let this happen. He knows in his bones that whatever this ritual is, it's not for protection. It's something darker, something meant to take their child away, to bind him to the malevolent force that has taken over his wife. He pushes past her, shoving her aside as he reaches for his son. But she grabs him, her fingers digging into his arm with unnatural strength, pulling him back. "It's too late," she says, her voice cold. "He's already promised." The narrator's heart pounds in his chest. He knows this is it, the moment where he must act, where he must stop whatever is happening, no matter the cost. His wife, the woman he once loved, stands between him and their son. But she is no longer herself. She has become something else, something that is willing to sacrifice their child to this dark force. In a desperate attempt to break her hold, he wrestles free from her grasp and lunges toward the crib. But just as he reaches his son, he feels a searing pain in his back. His wife has stabbed him. The shock of the blade piercing his skin makes him gasp. But the pain is nothing compared to the horror of realizing that she is willing to do this to him, for the sake of the ritual. He collapses to the floor, clutching his side, his vision blurring from the blood loss. His wife stands over him, the knife in her hand slick with his blood, her face calm, almost serene. "I'm sorry," she says softly, as if she's apologizing for something small, something inevitable. But it has to be this way. The narrator watches in horror as his wife turns back to the crib, the knife still in her hand. She raises it above their son, her eyes glassy, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she's under some unseen force's control. He tries to scream, to stop her, but his body is weak, the blood pouring from his wound pooling on the floor beneath him. "No, please," he croaks, his voice barely more than a whisper, but she doesn't stop. She begins to chant again, the dark words filling the room with a palpable, oppressive energy. As she lifts the knife higher, preparing to complete the ritual, The dark figure looms closer to their child. The narrator's mind is spinning, desperation clawing at his thoughts. He knows that if he doesn't stop her, if he doesn't act now, something terrible, something irreversible, will happen. With a final surge of adrenaline, fueled by nothing but sheer terror and the love for his son, the narrator pushes himself up from the floor. Every inch of his body screams in agony, but he forces himself to stand. His wife is too focused on the ritual to notice him. He stumbles toward her, his vision darkening at the edges, but he has only one thought: stop her. In a final desperate act, he lunges at her, grabbing her arm just as the knife begins to descend. They struggle, the blade flashing between them, her eyes wide and wild, filled with a dark intensity that is no longer human. The two of them grapple in the dim light, the shadows around them twisting unnaturally as the presence in the room seems to feed off their fear. In the chaos, the knife slips, and there is a sickening moment of silence. Blood spills onto the floor, but it isn't his blood. His wife collapses to the ground, the knife still in her hand, her eyes wide in shock, the life draining from them as she stares up at him in stunned silence. For a moment, the narrator can hardly breathe. His mind refuses to process what has just happened. He looks down at her lifeless body, the woman he once loved, now lying motionless on the floor, the knife still clutched in her hand. The dark figure that had been lurking in the room vanishes, dissolving into the shadows as though it had never existed. But the oppressive weight of its presence lingers, leaving a cold void in its wake. The room is deathly quiet. Only the soft breathing of his son, still asleep in the crib, breaks the silence. The narrator staggers to the crib, his body trembling with exhaustion, fear, and grief. He picks up his son, cradling him in his arms, his hands still slick with his wife's blood. He stands there for what feels like an eternity, his mind racing, his heart shattered. The woman he loved is gone. The dark force that had claimed her is gone too, but at what cost? What had she been willing to do? What had she almost sacrificed? And worst of all, what had he become in the process? The unspeakable act is done, but nothing will ever be the same. The house is oppressively quiet now. The air is thick, not with the malevolent presence that had haunted their family, but with the heavy silence that follows death. The narrator moves through the house in a daze, his son cradled in his arms, his mind still struggling to comprehend what has happened. His wife's body lies where she fell, a lifeless reminder of the unimaginable horror that unfolded only moments before. Her blood still stains the floor, the knife still clutched in her cold hand. He should call someone, he should get help, but he can't. His thoughts are fractured, looping endlessly around the fact that he was the one who killed her, the woman he once loved, now gone by his hand. The weight of her death hangs over everything. He takes his son and leaves the room, unable to bear the sight any longer. Every corner of the house feels different now, as though the walls themselves are mourning her loss, casting shadows darker than before. The once familiar home now feels alien, hostile, and filled with memories that threaten to drown him. The guilt is unbearable, a constant ache in his chest. The next few days blur together. The police arrive after he makes the agonizing call. He tells them the truth, at least part of it. He explains the break-in, the struggle, the tragedy. But he leaves out the part about the rituals, the dark figure, the malevolent force that had twisted his wife into something unrecognizable. No one would believe him. They'd think he was mad, or worse, responsible for it all. They take her body away, leaving the house empty and cold. The authorities tell him they'll be in touch, but for now, he's left alone with his son in a home that no longer feels like his own. The rooms echo with absence, but it's not just the emptiness that unnerves him. In the nights that follow, strange things begin to happen again. The soft creaking of footsteps in the hall when no one is there. The faint sound of whispers just beyond the edge of hearing, like the echo of his wife's voice, calling out to him from somewhere distant. He starts to see her face in reflections, just for a moment, before she vanishes. Her presence lingers, and it's not just in his mind. His son, too young to understand the full horror of what has transpired, begins to change. At first, the narrator writes it off as trauma from the incident, but it becomes clear that something deeper is at play. The baby, once peaceful and quiet, begins waking up in the night, crying hysterically. His cries are different now, more frantic, as if he's seeing something that his father cannot. One night, as the narrator cradles his son, trying to soothe him back to sleep, the child suddenly goes still, his eyes wide, staring at something over his father's shoulder. The hair on the back of the narrator's neck stands on end. He turns slowly, his heart pounding. But there's nothing there, just the shadows dancing in the corner of the room. But his son keeps staring, eyes locked on something unseen. "What do you see?" the narrator whispers, though he's terrified of the answer. The more time passes, the more convinced the narrator becomes that whatever evil had taken hold of his wife is not gone. The dark force, the presence that had haunted their home, seems to have left a mark on their child. His son begins speaking in his sleep, uttering strange, unintelligible phrases, whispers that sound all too similar to the chants his wife once murmured at the crib. The shadows in the house seem to deepen, stretching longer than they should. The air grows colder at night, and there are moments when the narrator feels like he's being watched, an icy, oppressive feeling of something unseen lurking just beyond his vision. And then one night he hears it, the soft sound of her voice. It's unmistakable. His wife's voice calling out from the darkness, a whisper that slithers through the silence, low and insistent. "I never left." The words chill him to the core. A few nights later, the narrator wakes to a strange, muffled noise coming from his son's room. Panic grips him as he rushes down the hallway, heart racing. He throws open the door and finds his son standing in his crib, staring at the far corner of the room. The shadows in the corner seem to move, swirling like thick smoke, forming into the same dark figure he had once seen hovering over the crib during his wife's ritual. It's back. The narrator is frozen in terror, his mind screaming to do something, anything. But he can't move. His son reaches out toward the figure, as if drawn to it, his tiny hands stretching into the darkness. "Stop!" the narrator yells, rushing forward and grabbing his child. The dark figure vanishes, melting into the shadows as though it was never there. But the feeling of its presence lingers. He holds his son tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The house feels alive with something malevolent, something that won't leave them alone. The narrator realizes the horrifying truth. This is not over. Whatever dark force his wife had been invoking, whatever ritual she had begun, it's still unfinished. The figure, the whispers, the strange behavior of his son, it's all connected. One night, as he searches through his wife's belongings, desperate for answers, he finds something. Hidden deep in her things is an old weathered journal. The pages are filled with strange symbols, cryptic writings, and dark esoteric texts. Flipping through it, he sees descriptions of rituals that match what she had been performing. And then he finds something that makes his blood run cold, a passage about their son. The child is marked. The ritual wasn't just about calling forth something dark, it was about binding it to their child. The story ends on a terrifying cliffhanger. The narrator stands over the crib, clutching his son tightly, his eyes wide with the realization that his son isn't just haunted. He's been claimed. The dark presence his wife had been worshiping, the malevolent force that had taken over their lives, isn't gone. It's inside their child. As the room grows darker, the shadows begin to twist again, forming into the shape he's seen so many times before. The dark figure, looming closer, its presence suffocating. The last thing the narrator hears before the lights go out is his wife's voice, a soft whisper that curls through the silence. "He belongs to us now."